Anyway, I want to welcome everybody to our weekly Thursday Zoom talk. Been doing them since middle of May. And if you're joining us for the first time and you're wondering what the Knoxville History Project stands for, we're a small nonprofit and our mission is to research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville. One of our projects that we're working on, we do every year, is we do a new collection of new stories. And so we're doing a follow-up to our Knoxville Lives book. It's a popular collection of stories. Last year, Jack included a story of the Ballad of Isaac Gammon, which has a connection with Market Square. A very long story that Jack did on Tennessee Williams and his connections to Tennessee. And one of our regular presenters and also watchers tonight is Laura Still, our favorite historian in town. She did a great story on Florence Payne, and she's doing a new one for our Knoxville Lives 2 booklet. Just completing that, I'm doing a story on Jim Thompson, a locally famous photographer in the Smokies, and Eric Dawson again from Tamas is submitting one, and Jack's working on a few as well. If you've bought a publication from KHP recently, we thank you very much. We've sold quite a few books in the last 2 months, certainly made up for several barren months. But Jack is going to be talking about the history of Market Square tonight, and he published the book Market Square, History of the Most Democratic Place on Earth, probably about 10 years ago. It's in its 2nd edition. I encourage you, if you've not read that, to check that out. And consider ordering one from our website at knoxvillehistoryproject.org. And also with Halloween coming up, I want to put in a little promo for Laura's wonderful book, Haunted History of Knoxville, which has been out several years now, but it's a wonderful book on ghost stories, but based on not only Jack's research, but also just the rich history of this town. Also want to put a plug in for our shop where you can buy some of these books. And if you made a donation to the Knoxville History Project recently, we sincerely appreciate you helping us along our way so we can educate all of you free of charge every week and everything else that we do. And also, if you've not made a donation, we encourage you to consider doing that, supporting us. Also, if you would like to revisit or catch up on any Zooms that you've missed in previous weeks, Nicole is recording them every week and we're putting them on our portal. So if you go to the main page on our website and go to the portal up top, that's where we've got a lot of historical stories and all kinds of different things. But on the 2nd row is podcasts and dialogues. You'll find, I think we've got about 10 or 12 recordings of our recent Zooms. So if you've missed them or would want to watch one again, I encourage you to check that out. And finally, mentioned donating again. We get too obsessed with that, but we appreciate it. I want to put a plug in for next week. We're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be kind of doing a trip around Knoxville, a lot of places downtown, but looking at all the statues that we have and the history behind those that me and Jack will be talking about. So that's on the calendar for October the 1st, week today. So I'm going to hand it over to Jack to talk about the history of Market Square.
Right. Thanks a lot, Paul. Market Square is a real challenge, as Laura Still knows, on walking tours. Anytime you walk into Market Square, you just have to size up your audience and see how much do they really want to know, because even if you just hit the high points, just the most interesting stuff about the history of Market Square, it could take an hour or so, and that's kind of what we're going to do tonight, I think. But Market Square is a fascinating place. It's one of the, in fact, I think it is the oldest secular piece of property continuously used. At least no piece of property has been used for one purpose for longer than Market Square has, except for some churches and graveyards. So even the courthouse today and the courthouse lot today, as ancient as it seems, is not as old as Market Square is. And it's been under some stress this year. Of course a lot of the usual activities in Market Square aren't happening. The concerts, the jazz shows that I love, the farmers market that I hardly ever miss a Saturday there, had to move from Market Square because Market Square tends to create crowds and people being very close, dangerously close together this year. So it's the Market Square Farmers Market still exists, but it's over at Mary Costa Plaza over near the Coliseum. But even so, with all the shutdowns and all the closings and all the cancellations, people can't stay away from Market Square. It's every single day of the quarantine, there have been people walking around in the square just looking for something, just saying hello, just something. And there have been a few street performers there, not necessarily a team, but they're street performers there, and they're drawing little cautious crowds as well. So it's still a place that, as it has been since 1854, a place where people tend to gather. Most older cities have a market square of some sort, a place for farmers to bring their produce, and a lot of cities still have them. There's some great market squares in New Orleans and Washington, D.C. That have a lot of their original heritage going on, and a lot of activity still. There are a lot of cities that have lost their market squares, and it's interesting that back in the 1990s, when Knoxville was envying Chattanooga as being this city that had an aquarium and had this great downtown revival going on, Chattanooga admitted, I went down there to see what was working down there, and a lot of stuff was working very well, but they kept saying, I really wish that we had one thing that Knoxville still has, besides the University of Tennessee, and they said, and that's Market Square. We used to have a Market Square, we lost it. They tried to recobble one together, sort of inspired by Knoxville's Market Square that was kind of coming back alive and beginning to work some, and they called it Miller Plaza. And it's not as big as Market Square, not quite as doesn't have quite as much various stuff going on there as our Market Square does, but it's still kind of a central point for public events down there. Anyway, we're lucky we still have this thing, because we nearly lost it in the 1950s and perhaps at other times in our history. But it goes back to the 1850s. The 1850s was a time when Knoxville was changing really rapidly. Knoxville had been the state capital years earlier, even though it was a very tiny state capital. It had just a few hundred, a couple thousand people living here. And it was all kind of clustered over near the river. But the city began to change pretty radically in the 1850s with a great deal of growth to the north. Before the 1850s, there were farmers who came to Knoxville to sell, but they tended to kind of just jumble together over on Gay Street, and they blocked traffic, and it became kind of a civic hazard, a kind of a problem for the city. So people have been saying, gosh, I think we need something like a Market Square. Well, the city, as I mentioned, was growing rapidly. It was growing partly, the biggest single factor was that Knoxville, after 25 years of trying to get a railroad into Knoxville, suddenly in 1855, it was arriving. And by 1854, people knew it was arriving. And it was arriving not through the center part of town, which was along the river, not on top of the river bluff, but over to the north of the traditional downtown of that day. It was on the ground below the river bluff, where you wouldn't have to build a giant trestle up to reach where the courthouse and all that sort of thing is. But to build it there, you were kind of stretching the idea of what Knoxville was to the north. And as the railroad came through on the north side, people realized that, gosh, this northern half of what we now know as downtown is going to be a center of attention. And a couple of young guys, kind of young guys on the make, I might say, one guy named William Swan, who became mayor of Knoxville for a while, and Joseph Mabry got together and had a real estate scheme. I'd heard of these guys. That the short, thumbnail version of Market Square is that it was founded by William Swan and Joseph Mabry to be a farmer's market forever for the people of Knoxville. And you think of philanthropists as being older guys, established guys who want to do something good for their community. These guys were young. They were in their 20s and early 30s. I think Mabry was the younger of the two. And they got together and put something together not as a purely philanthropic gesture, but as a big real estate scheme. They bought a bunch of acreage on the north side of the traditional part of Knoxville, the part north of Clinch Avenue, which had been mainly corrals and a few houses and things. And they bought several acres of this land, and they thought, well, we want to be sure that this land is going to be valuable forever to the city of Knoxville. So what if we donate the middle part of it to be a market square? And this will raise the value of all the acreage all around it, and make something special of it. By the way, Joseph Mabry on the right is the same fellow who built the Mabry Hazen House. Which you can visit today. That house was built I think about 3 years after he founded Market Square. But he is believed to be I think the more influential of the two in terms of Market Square itself. William Swan was actually mayor of Knoxville for a while and was a very progressive guy, brought in gas lights and a lot of modern improvements. He later became a hardcore secessionist, became a Confederate representative in the Confederate Congress, and was so Confederate that he did not return to Knoxville, but moved to Memphis after the war, which is where he died not long after the war. But Joseph Mabry stuck around for a while, and a lot of you know met an untimely end in 1882 when he and his son were shot to death by Thomas O'Connor on Gay Street, right in front of Thomas O'Connor's bank, the Mechanics Bank on the 600 block of Gay Street. And of course they shot O'Connor too. So all three combatants died within seconds of each other on almost the same spot. And a long story about that. We did a whole hour-long presentation about that at the bowling alley a couple of years ago. But anyway, let's move on to the next slide, Paul. This is believed to be Joseph Mabry's sketch of what Market Square was to look like, and we found this pasted in the city council minutes of 1853, I believe. But this, you see Union Street on the side. Asylum Street is what the original name of Wall Avenue was. So that shows you from the Union on the south side to Asylum or Wall on the north side, and the marketplace in the middle is what he described it. And he showed, interestingly, not a market house, but just a bunch of businesses on either side, which is kind of what we have now. The space that we have now looks wider than what he envisioned, or what he at least drew a sketch of for the benefit of the city alderman at the time. And I don't know if that's his hand over there pointing to the north, but that's we think that this was actually a drawing by or on behalf of Joe Mabry. Walnut Street, of course, and Gay Street have their same names, and there are or were alleys on both sides. The alley on the bottom side is still intact there. But it's interesting that he drew this without a market house, because the market house was the first thing that was actually built in 1854 on this spot, and it was built kind of toward the southern end of that marketplace area, about where the M and the A are, was where the original market house was. If you want to go to Market Square today and see the area where the green area where the trees are, that was kind of basically the original plot of this old brick market house. And it was like an old-fashioned, like a very small version of what you see in Charleston or New Orleans, kind of an open sort of a place with eaves all around it, and kind of arches that you could walk through. Here's a rare picture of the market house, and this shows you. I mentioned earlier how that this was an area of a really rough-edged area. You see these kind of unfinished wood barns and things on the north side of downtown. But this is what it looked like before they established Market Square. This is in 1859, I believe, looking from south toward the river, from about where LMU Law School campus is. But that building that Paul was waving the arrow around, that's the original Market House, right there. One of the very few pictures we have of that Market House. And you see there's nothing yet built around it, but but Mabry and Swan knew there was just a matter of time before people, well, there's a little bit on this side, on the west side of the square that were buildings that were built, I think, to face the market house. And none of them are still there. The buildings we see today were from just a few years later, but you see they were just it was like a cow pasture or something, and they just plopped down a market house in the middle of it and trusted that people were going to buy and build close around it. And by the mid 1860s, even by some people think some buildings there were built actually during the Civil War. It was shaping up as a marketplace. All right, this is a really early bird's eye view of Market Square from 1871. And you see that building in the middle of it that we were just talking about. That's the original market house. And you see buildings on the east and west sides. And I ran across several descriptions of Market Square from the early days that pointed out that the east side was not finished until sometime in the early 1870s. So there's a space up near Asylum Street that was just an open area where they had open sales. And later on, Mayor High School gave a talk there. He played a major role in the future of Market Square because he was mayor when they built the market house. But he talked about when he was a child, the very first bicycle he ever saw was on sale in that little vacant lot near Asylum in about 1865. But that little cubicle building to the north, that is the old City Hall. That was Knoxville's first City Hall. Now, if you talk to old folks and they talk about old City Hall, that's another place. But this is the even older City Hall. This was there in 1868, and it was used until about 1924. That was Knoxville City Hall. And it's notable for a few things, and Paul briefly alluded to this earlier, that any city hall is important to a city, and this was a place where the mayor and city council met. It's also where the police station was, and they had a very small jail there called the Hooskow in that same one little building. But this was the place in 1869 when the cement was barely drying on the place, when Knoxville elected its first black city councilman, its first black alderman. And those first two black aldermen were named Isaac Gammon, who was the Knoxville representative, and there was another named David Brown, who was originally elected as the East Knoxville representative, but they happened to merge Knoxville and East Knoxville into one, and combine the two city councils into one big city council. But it's remarkable to mention that that was really early in the history of Western civilization. Frankly, people say, gosh, that's early for the South. There weren't any city councils in the world that had white and black councilmen that I know of. If you all know of any, let me know. I've looked and looked and looked and looked, and I've not found any examples outside of Tennessee. Tennessee was extraordinary in this regard because Tennessee had it was a state with, of course, a very large black population, many of them former slaves, who were suddenly free and were able to vote because Tennessee passed early a suffrage law to allow black men in Tennessee to vote. And this was, and they did vote by 1867 or so. And by 1869, there were two black city councilmen in city council. I think Nashville and Chattanooga both share this history. They had early biracial city councils, but Knoxville and Nashville and Chattanooga were three of the first cities in the history of the world to have biracial city councils. I've said that in print before, and nobody's really challenged it yet. But I don't know of any other examples. You know, Chicago, I don't think that it had any city councilmen and black city councilmen until the 20th century. There were lots that was more typical. But this was kind of a thing for about 50 years after the Civil War. More often than not, we had at least one black man, and sometimes as many as three on city council. So it was, that's, I think, something that deserves commemoration when we talk about the northern end of Market Square. I'd say they're much less worthy subjects for a plaque to talk about this is where this happened. But all right, but that's such a cool picture. This is a few years later, just what, 15 years later, and look how big the city has gotten. It's a much bigger, more dense, booming city. The city was at this time probably 3 or 4 times as large as it was then. And that era was just going up and down the somewhat longer extended market house that was there, and City Hall was still there kind of behind it. And by that time we have in the foreground, sort of, you see the the building that's now that's the Kern building. It was built in 1876. We'll be talking more about Peter Kern later. He was a really remarkable fellow, a German immigrant who came here and started a very popular bakery and candy factory, and had just an amazing kind of an emporium of wonderful things in that building that I'm really glad to say is still there. Now in this picture, a lot of the buildings you see in this picture are still there today on both sides of Market Square, including the Kern building. Something to note in the foreground with the building with a P on it, that's the old Second Presbyterian Church, and that was right there. And it's kind of surprising to see buildings behind it, because that was the spot where the churchyard was. I'm trying to see if I'm mixed up there, but no, I think I think maybe it was just more on the corner. I think it was a pretty small churchyard. But anyway, that's a remarkable thing. And then just down the way, that kind of palatial looking building is what they call the Girls' High School, and that was where the Daylight building is. That over a little bit to the right there, Paul. Yeah, there we go. With that tall tower, that was the Girls' High School, and it later became the kind of the foundation of Knoxville High School. That was the very first Knoxville High School. That's where Clarence Brown, the Hollywood director, went to school, among many other people. But anyway, it's you can just pour over these maps. They're fascinating to look at. These are old bird's eye view maps. We don't do it anymore. Down in the bottom, you see the Custom House building. That's the building marked B, which is, I'm glad to say, also still there. That was built in 1874. But that's the old post office and federal courthouse building. All right, let's look at the next one, Paul. All right, it was not always a neat, tidy place, Market Square. This is a shot looking north from Union Avenue. I don't know if we have a date on this, we're probably 1880s, but it's, you see the City Hall building, that taller building in the back. This is Market Square, the old Market Square, before they built the Market House that some people over of a certain age remember. This was the building that was there before that. Kind of disheveled at this point. It doesn't look quite as fresh as it did, but you still see the archways openings that you saw in earlier drawings. But Market Square by the 1880s was a place where everything happened. It was everybody got together on Market Square. It was made as designed as a place for farmers to sell their produce, but by this time there were all sorts of retailers and boarding houses. There were probably 7 or 8 or 9 boarding houses on Market Square at this time. And I like to bring up boarding houses because this was one of the very few. This is one of the first female professions that women could run a boarding house, and they with skills they had learned as either as housewives or growing up in a family where the women were expected to do all the housework. That's what you need to do to run a boarding house, to change the beds and cook the meals and all the stuff for all these people coming through. Boarding houses were like bed and breakfast. They were places where people, traveling salesmen or whoever would stay for a night, or some others would move in. Sometimes people literally lived in boarding houses if they were unmarried, and it was a great place because you got to know your neighbors, and you came to a family dinner once or twice a day. Some of these boarding house ladies would come out and ring bells if they had extra space at the table. They would ring a bell, and at lunchtime, and people would just strangers off the street would come in and join the people who lived there. This picture is interesting. If you look down the way, you see that building with a kind of an unusual pediment up at the top with on the right on the east side of the square. Yeah, that is a mortar and pestle kind of bit of ornamentation up there. That was the George Washington Albers pharmacy. His brother, Andrew Jackson Albers, they were both from Ohio, had both been in the Union Army. George Washington Albers liked the retail side, and he had a retail pharmacy on Market Square. His brother, Andrew Jackson Albers, ran what became known as Albers Drugs, and was a major wholesaler. And Albers Drugs was one of the longest lasting businesses in Knoxville history. As we were looking at this earlier, we noticed a couple things. One, you see kind of the ghost on the left side in the background of the steeple of Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, which was built in 1885. So that we know that this picture was taken after that. And over here on the right, there's what looks like a tower of a Victorian house. And I'm intrigued with whose house that was, because I've seen some references to a house, kind of a mansion up there. I'm not sure who lived there, but that had a deer park, had like a fenced in area that had actual live deer living in there among the flowers and trees. Anyway, you can study a picture like this for a long time, and even though it looks junky, it was a busy place. Everybody came to Market Square, regardless of your social station or race or whatever. You would come here and sell and buy, and it was just a place where everybody came. All right, next picture. All right, here's a kind of close-up of City Hall. There aren't many of these, and it shows you City Hall, as I mentioned, was a diverse place because there were black aldermen. But this is remarkable because this is the police force who are based in City Hall, and you see at least 2, maybe 3 black policemen here. Knoxville was, according to Bob Booker, was one of only 6 cities in America that had black policemen, and how they were treated was kind of different. Administration to administration. Some of them did not warn them about arresting white men. Their main job was to patrol the black parts of town, but they may not have had those same all the same privileges. But they were armed. They went out in the community, and they did good work, apparently, because Knoxville had black policemen for for most of the history of the police department. So this is an unusual picture in that it actually demonstrates that. All right. Okay, here is the Market House, and this is an unusual one. This because you see in the foreground, the Arnstein building has not been built yet. This was you don't see any graves, but this was the churchyard of Second Presbyterian Church. This fenced off area in the foreground. And of course, Kern's, I'm glad that building, of course, is still there. It's Tupelo Honey and other things, and the Oliver Hotel. But the Market House was built in 1897, and this replaced that kind of run down looking building we just saw a picture of. But this was considered just an amazingly modern thing at the time. It had large women's rooms that were advertised as being hygienically sound, but advertised as being a way to teach rural women how to take better care of themselves. It had this kind of progressive educational purpose as well, because a lot of women who grew up in the country weren't used to modern ideas of hygiene. But I want to read this. This is the building that was still there until 1960. Was torn down in 1960. But Cormac McCarthy described it in his novel Suttree as the Market House, where brick, the color of dried blood, rose turreted and cupoled and crazed into the heat of the day, form on form, in demented accretion, without precedent or counterpart in the annals of architecture. I don't know if that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's an unusual building, and it's kind of Some architects in the 1950s were making fun of it, but it was an interesting building. It was Bowman brothers designed it, and they're the same people who designed the Catholic Church up on the hill, and several other, and Joseph Bowman designed the Kern building 20 years earlier. He was our first full-time professional architect. But this is a cool building, a cool picture, because it has this. It's a rare picture of this churchyard, which is where General Sanders was originally buried, and during the Civil War in 1863, the guy for whom Fort Sanders was named, and for reasons unknown, at the time the church sold the property and they built the Arnstein building here. They moved the graves, and for reasons unknown, Sanders was moved to Chattanooga, which a city he had no known connection to. But his grave is in the National Cemetery there. But anyway, the market, a little bit more about the market house. It was like I said, it was very modern. It had here's another color picture of it, and it kind of shows you the dry blood thing that Cormac McCarthy was talking about. But it had on the second floor, it had a big auditorium which held about 1,000 people, and this was a place where some of the early country music artists, but also people like Duke Ellington performed there in 1934. But Roy Acuff played there many times. Also, they had lectures there. Booker T. Washington was there, gave a lecture in the early 1900s. Carrie Nation, the famous hatchet-wielding prohibitionist, gave an apparently effective lecture in 1906, because the following year, the whole male voting populace of Knoxville voted to ban saloons in town. Maybe they're afraid she would come back and cause some trouble. But who else? William Jennings Bryan spoke there. Some of the early suffragists, and Ellis Dudley, they had a big suffrage conference there in 1915. Lizzie Crozier French, I think a conservative estimate is that she spoke there probably 100 times in her career in the market hall. She was there a lot, but it was still there later on in the 1920s when the early people who were planning this Great Smoky Mountains National Park had mass meetings, public meetings held in the up in the market hall there. But what else? The ground floor, of course, is where they had the market stalls, and the more affluent farmers who could afford rent, and other businesses, the bakeries and butcher shops and so forth. You could rent stalls inside the market house, but you could sell your stuff for free in the alleys outside the market house. So that was why there was so much activity on the outside. The market, everybody talks about it. It's funny how many people come to me every time I talk about Market Square. I said, "There's one thing I got to tell you. This one thing, Jack, about the market house." And I say, I know the smell. People think I haven't heard about this. Everybody who remembers going there, even if it was as recently as 1959, remembers the vivid smell of the place. It was, and you can kind of get a sense in this picture of what that might have been. But they did some butchering here in the market house back in the 1800s. They actually kill livestock on Market Square, but they didn't do that after about 1890. I think they had what they call abattoirs outside of town, so that they didn't have quite that level of stuff. But they did have lots of fish. They had a guy named Louis Lippner, who was from Vienna, Austria, a Jewish fishmonger, had a kosher and non-kosher side, and he would show people how to prepare things in the kosher side, but he was especially known for his fresh fish. But you could get almost anything in the market house. I love the story that the Greek owned restaurant known as the Gold Sun, which was literally open 24 hours, a 24-hour restaurant, because Knoxville was a 24-hour town, because trains came in all through the day and the night. But the Gold Sun was, they carried things like fried chicken and hamburgers, and that's the kind of thing they advertised. But they enjoyed a challenge, and if you walked into the Gold Sun and asked them to prepare something they'd never heard of, they would give it a shot, and they would just walk out into the Market Square and buy while you sat there in the restaurant. and buy what you're asking for, because you could get almost anything in Market Square, and come back and do their best with it. But it was a fascinating place. I'm sorry I'm not old enough to remember it, because everything I've heard about it sounds interesting, even if it's smelly. But anyway, yeah. Okay, here's a shot of Kern's, the original Kern's building, which wasn't just Kern's Bakery. It was the third floor was actually what they call the Oddfellows Hall, and that was where the Oddfellows fraternity met. But they also had a good many concerts, early like chamber music concerts and things like that. The local Lutheran church was founded in this building up in that part. But the second floor had what they called an ice cream saloon, and we may have another shot of that later on. But the ground floor had a candy shop, a confectionery, yeah, here we go. Here's a good picture of both of them. This candy shop and confectionery, and in the book we have a picture of the soda fountain in there, and you can see in this picture from the 1880s or so, you can look very closely they had about 40 different kinds of soft drinks, and just one of them was Coca-Cola. And I think a lot of people first encountered Coca-Cola in this room at Kern's confectionery. But that inset, and this is from over 100 years ago, this kind of promotional piece with the palm leaves and all that inset, you can see what kind of a place that ice cream saloon was. They had chandeliers, they had original art on the walls, they had marble top tables, and people would go in there. They were open till midnight every night, selling ice cream, and they had waiters would wait on your table. It was a place to take dates. It was just a lovely place. And it's not surprising that Peter Kern, this jolly guy from Germany, who I think did a lot to promote the celebration of holidays. He was here kind of as an accident of war during the Civil War. Just kind of landed here and was here was here during Union occupation. He had been a Confederate soldier and was captured, was jailed, and the Union Army interviewed him, and the poor German guy didn't know, he'd been a cobbler at one time, and he didn't really have any resources. But they said, look, you're not a threat. We're going to let you out of jail, but just you're under city arrest, kind of. Just stay in this city for the duration of the war. At this time, I think he had a farm in Alabama or Georgia, and that's why he had joined the Confederate Army early on. But he met another German. He said, I've got this great idea. Why don't we? If you have $1 to buy a barrel of molasses, I've got $1 to buy a barrel of flour, and I think we can make hoe cakes and sell them to the Union troop trains that come through town every day. And they did that. He said, I thought that's a great idea. And they began baking, just first selling these simple little hoe cakes. But Peter Kern, who had been a cobbler back in Germany, decided that he liked baking, and he learned a lot more and more about it. He made candy. He advertised that his place was the biggest candy factory in the South. But he also, as I mentioned, had a soda fountain and ice cream, and had an ice cream machine, with all sorts of fancy things. But the bakery was in the back. That building in the back was the bakery. And Kern himself, this guy who he lived in New York, he lived in Georgia, he lived in Baltimore at one time, I think. He'd moved all over the country, and of course he lived back in Germany as a young man. But he, in his later years, hardly ever had to leave this block, because his house, he and his wife and their large family lived in a house back on Walnut Street, right behind this house. And they're very proud of their horses. They had a two-story horse stable back there where they had their own horses, as well as the horses they used for the bread wagons that they hauled around. But he was such a popular guy, and I say he was from Germany. He knew more about Christmas than we did. He showed us how to decorate Christmas trees. He and his wife were famous for that. But he was elected mayor in 1890. He was our last immigrant mayor. We had 6 immigrant mayors in the 19th century, and he was the very last one. But it's amazing to think of a mayor with a German accent, but he was one. But fascinating guy, and I'm glad that we still have his building. All right. Okay, here's a kind of a famous picture of what people have over the years thought might be a suffragist, but she was actually a prohibitionist. Her name is Vera Smith, and she was exhorting the crowd with a song. And you see, it's a biracial crowd, and they're all right together. They're black and white men, and it was the men who were the voters, so that's who she was trying to appeal to in 1907, to try to get them to vote down saloons. And it's kind of ironic that only men were allowed in saloons and only men were allowed to vote, but men decided to ban saloons. And there were 107 saloons in Knoxville in 1907, if you can imagine that. And most of them were right downtown, and some of them were on Market Square. That's one of the great things about Market Square, that it's where opposites come together. Opposites came to respect and appreciate each other. This, I think, certain social media today kind of divides people. Market squares bring people together. They didn't agree on these things, but they saw each other every day. They looked each other in the eye and were able to sometimes muster a smile to each other. But there were 7 saloons on Market Square, and the headquarters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union for East Tennessee was on Market Square. All these things were right there. So there were Confederate and Union veterans halls on Market Square, right directly across from each other. The completely different kinds of people here. And that's why I love it's in the subtitle of the book, a description of Market Square by a journalist in 1900. They said, "This must be the most democratic place on earth, because only on Market Square do rich and poor, black and white people jostle each other in perfect equality." That was in 1900, description of Market Square. And you see them jostling in this picture. But yeah. Okay, here's some more suffrage. We've been digging more into the suffrage story this year with our help from our friend Laura Still. But there's quite a lot of suffrage activity on Market Square, especially in the Market House. And you see this ad for a speech at Market Hall. I'm not sure what year that was, but obviously Mrs. Elsie French, Lizzie Crozier French, our leading suffragist, was there, and there's a suffrage lecture that she had frequent guest speakers there over the years. There was a dramatic event in I'm trying to think, in 1917, I think it was, when a woman, trying to remember her name, who was considered a kind of a radical, militant was the word they used at the time, a militant suffragist. Maud Younger was her name, but she was had wanted to speak at the Market Hall, and the tradition was over the years to let almost anybody who could afford the fee, and often the fee was paid by the city or by individual city councilman, to speak at the Market Hall could do that. And that was, and Lizzie Crozier French had already arranged for that. And she was scheduled, Maud Younger, who had been one of the militants who was demonstrating at the White House, was down here and wanted to speak to us. And some of the, of course, male city councilmen and others got kind of unnerved about this idea, and she was barred from speaking at the Market Hall, which was really unusual, because they had let socialists speak there before, but not women who were agitating for the right to vote. But the long story, but she ended up giving a talk outside after also having been barred from speaking in the courthouse, speaking outside the courthouse to a group of several hundred people outside, and made it all the more dramatic, perhaps, for that having to resort to that. But quite a lot of political history in Market Square. You could write a book just about that. All right, next slide. All right, here's of course the suffrage statue, And when they first put this up, I think I said something snide. I said, well, these three women probably hardly even knew each other. And they weren't together very much, if at all, but there was that time in 1914 when Lizzie Crozier French in the middle and Ann Dallas Dudley on the right from Nashville did speak together in the Market Hall. But that was the only time I've run across that the two of them were actually literally together in life and not just in a statue. But there might have been other times. I'm sure there were other times, but that was the one time I've run across here in Knoxville that they were here together. All right, next one. Okay, here's just, and I consider this part of Market Square. This is the Arnstein building. It's right just across the Union Avenue. This was built in 1906 on the site of the old Second Presbyterian churchyard after the graves had been moved. But this was considered just a great achievement for Knoxville. This was the tallest building in the city, taller slightly than the old Von Dome, which was on Clinch Avenue. And it was enabled to be so tall because it was the first building ever built in Knoxville with steel frame construction. That was revolutionary at the time and was the reason there were so many, suddenly there were skyscrapers. It was dangerous to build a building purely of masonry that was this big in those days. So steel frame construction made that possible. Max Arnstein was a German Jewish immigrant who had set up had a store originally on Gay Street with his cousin. One of the Baruch family was here. I think an uncle or so of Bernard Baruch, the famous financier of the 20th century. But they worked together in the 1880s. I think Baruch moved on, and Arnstein took over. He and his wife Lala ran this department store that wasn't the biggest department store in town. That would have been Miller's probably. It was probably the fanciest. They had the finest imported clothing and that sort of thing. Lala, by the way, as we pointed out in our suffrage tour that Laura helped us with, was one of the first women to be elected to public office in Knoxville. Very soon after women got the vote, she became a member of county court, which was kind of the equivalent of county commission back in those days. But back in 1923 or 4, she was elected. But the Arnstein building, the main part of the, I think the large floors on the lower part were where the department store was. The upper floors were offices. And I like to point out that the great expositions at Challahowie Park, including the National Conservation Exposition of 1913, were planned upstairs at the Arnstein building. But a great building that I'm glad we have. It was designed by a New York firm called Cleverton and Putzel. And a lot of people say, gosh, that looks like a New York building. And it's not surprising because they have actually several buildings on Broadway were designed by the same firm. And Broadway in New York were designed by Cleverton and Putzel. But kind of a Beaux-Arts, I guess, building, early 1906. Of course, soon, within a few years, there were much taller buildings than this, but this was just an amazing thing to behold in Knoxville in 1906. And it was, they had kind of a big grand opening of it. I think the first time I ever heard of a mayor riding in an automobile was to come to the dedication of the Arnstein building at that time. And that was Sam High School. All right. And by the way, the Arnsteins ran the place until 1928, which I always say that was the best year in the history of the world to retire, because they cashed out, and Max Arnstein was 65, and they moved to New York. He lived to be 101 years old, I think. Anyway, this is the other end of the square, just an odd kind of picture of the Stratford Hotel, which was still there until it was torn down for the TVA towers in the 1970s. This was on Wall Avenue. We're kind of standing on Market Square, looking sort of to the northwest from there. But that was one of several hotels along Wall Avenue that the St. James was a few hundred feet to the right of here. Next picture. All right, here's another great kind of a 20th century picture of what we just saw earlier. This is the east side of the square looking north, and we see all these, instead of horses and wagons, we see cars just as crowded or more so than they had been in the horse and buggy era. But this kind of shows a lot of the people. You see what the loafers they talk about, the people just hung out in front of the market house. You see the farmers and their vendors. You see melons along this truck in the foreground. Some farmers would literally sleep underneath their cars at night, and just would keep selling until they were done, and drive back home to the mountains or where that might be. But we're looking north, and most of the buildings, I'm glad to say, on the right are still there. Looking north, though, to a building that's not still there, that's the T.E. Burns Company. That was a big wholesale grocery business that was kind of proud of having kind of exotic stuff. If you wanted to find something from overseas, imported goods like orange marmalade and things like that, that would be at T.E. Burns. Just a little bit fancier than your average wholesale grocer. But all right. And here is a kind of a grainy black and white shot looking at the market house as it was probably around 1930, I'm thinking. And you could see that they kind of didn't have that much respect for Victorian architecture in the mid 20th century. They had a big Pepsi Cola billboard just covering up the whole front of that, and probably didn't by 1930 or 40 when Victorian architecture was old-fashioned and embarrassing, probably nobody complained. But that was what it looked like. To orient yourself, you can see the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church spire in the background, and the City Hall building is still there. But this is all these pictures are pretty interesting to look at. But of course, Kern in the lower left. This was after Kern's had moved to Chapman Highway, by the way. I think they moved there in around 1930, I think, built that new place on Chapman Highway. That's now a historic building too. Unfortunately, both of the Kern's buildings are still there. Oh, here are the Morrisons. Mary Linda Schwarzbach's parents are one of our founding board members' parents. And Mary Linda and I got to know each other because I had written about her father, who ran a record store with the help of his wife, Virginia, called the Bell Sales Company. And it was on the east side of the square, not far from where the West property is, like the Preservation Pub and things like that are very close to where this was. But I like to bring this up, not just because it's a bit of trivia about a famous rock and roll star, but because it says something about Market Square that even on a national basis, Market Square had a reputation as a place where all of America came and kind of mixed together in one place. In the early 1950s, there was a guy who was a scout for RCA who was in town, and he had, even before 1954, he had this theory that Market Square and Bell Sales Company in particular was a place that was kind of like a bellwether for the country, that if something sold well at Bell Sales Company on Market Square, where everybody, old and young, black and white, everybody came, it had a potential to go nationwide. And he must have observed this with country stars, perhaps, and other people that Sam Morrison's, whose record Sam Morrison might have carried. But he came here in the summer of 1954, and he said, "Hey Sam, what's going on?" And one thing that Sam Morrison did was that he had a promotional thing. It makes sense to have new records and play them on a record player inside, but have it on a speaker that would blast out into Market Square where everybody's walking by buying produce or whatever. And he said, I haven't seen anything like this record. See what happens when I play this. This is a new record from Memphis. I'm going to play it. Watch what happens. And he played the song And just suddenly people came in from the square and said, "What is that? I've never heard anything like that in my life." According to this guy whose name was Brad McEwen, I think, from New York, he said old and young, black and white, all kinds of people were coming in here to want to buy one of these records. And according to Brad McEwen, who's quoted in the Elvis Presley biography, Mystery Train, not Last Train to Memphis, I think it's called, that came out back in the late 90s. I never heard this story before I read this in the biography. According to that quotation, Sam Morrison had sold hundreds, maybe even thousands of copies of this record just in the space of a few weeks. He said he just couldn't keep it in stock. And this was amazing for McEwen to see this happen. And he bought a copy for himself, and he bought a copy for the president of RCA in New York. And they began working on this guy, Elvis Presley. The song, of course, was "That's All Right, Mama," and which he had recorded for Sun Records in Memphis, but which was not at all well known outside of West Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana, maybe. They said, let's try to sign this guy, and it took them a few months, but they finally did sign Elvis Presley. Not that was the best thing that could have happened to him, but I love the story about the fact that Market Square was such a diverse place that it served as sort of a bellwether for the entire nation in its musical tastes. But thanks to Mary Linda for loaning us these great pictures. It's surprising how few pictures there are of retailers, and I wish there were more. All right, here's another somewhat later picture, perhaps. We're looking south on, actually this is probably 1940s, just looking at the car, but looking south from up near Wall Avenue, or maybe kind of the middle part of the square. But you can tell we're looking south because that building in the background is the old Empire building that was torn down in the 70s. That was on the corner of Market and Church, I think. But one of the taller buildings ever torn down in Knoxville. But just kind of a day in the life. I'm judging by hairstyles, I'm thinking this is probably 1945 or 46 or something like that. But and the short wide tie on the guy back there. But great old picture. All right, this is from the same era, but this is an amazing photograph. Not just the eye-catching or composition of it, but it's probably the most famous photographer ever worked in Knoxville. His name was Henri Cartier-Bresson. He captured this picture of Knoxville in 1947, and I wondered. I saw this photograph not in a local source. I saw it in a national photography magazine called American Photographer back in the 90s, and they had a full 2-page spread of it. It was about Cartier-Bresson, the famous French photographer who was known for just capturing people at the decisive moment, was his term. And he was most famous for his pictures in Paris, but he came through America and did a couple of tours of America, but came through Knoxville and spent a couple of days here and got this really great picture, which I think is just titled Knoxville, Tennessee. And I puzzled over this for a while, trying to figure out where it was exactly. I just something about the jewelers and so forth. I tried to force it on Gay Street, Cold Drugs and things like that, things that I had noticed on Gay Street before. But I began looking more carefully at it and realized that this is on Market Square, and this is that is the Arnstein building in the background, and in the deep background you see the General building, the bank building that's still there. But I love this picture, and I'm really glad that we're happy to run this credit because we're glad that that the KMA, Knoxville Museum of Art, owns this picture now, and to use it, you have to get their permission. They just bought it about a year or two ago, and it's kind of a famous picture, and they have it at the KMA. But just what a picture! I have no idea what is up with this woman. She's wearing a fur coat. She has a stylish coif. Looks like she just got out of the beauty parlor. She has an eye patch, and she looks like she's about to drive her truck, but there's a chicken crate on the hood, and you see that this old truck, the original mirror is broken off. It's what is her story? If anybody out there recognizes this woman and wants to to let us know what she's up to, it's a noir, kind of a hillbilly noir sort of thing. I love this this picture. If there's not a better symbol for Knoxville, you know, a beautiful woman in a fur coat and a beat up pickup truck, I can't think of one. It's a great picture. But, all right, and here is the end of the market house. I mentioned it was torn down. There are lots of stories that a lot of people will tell you a very shorthand story. Oh, of course, it burned down. It didn't burn down. There was the city council, it had been marked for death already. A couple of mayors in a row had wanted to tear it down for parking or something else on the square. And there were still some people trying to save it. Carl Sandburg, the poet who lived in North Carolina at the time, came over a couple of times and spoke in favor of keeping the market house. He was anyway. He loved the place. He'd first seen it back in 1940 and kind of made a regular habit of coming over here when he lived in North Carolina. But also Bird Vincent, the News Sentinel columnist, loved the market house. But most other people didn't care that much for it. It was Victorian. It was old-fashioned. It was dirty. It was smelly, and it did catch on fire at Christmas time in 1959. But it damaged just part of it. And they were at one time going to try to fix it up, and it just damaged such a small part of it that it opened. Most of it was open the next day, and it was still used the next day. But the processes of city council kept churning, and they finally decided to go ahead and demolish it about 4 or 5 months later. And what they did, they had an interesting idea though, and it was a modern idea for the time, was to have a pedestrian mall. And have an area for pedestrians. And this is a postcard from about 1961 or so, when Market Square Mall was new, and it was considered a success in the early days. I was a little bit surprised. A lot of people talk about the mall as if it were an embarrassing mistake, but they built these, what they call the concrete toadstools, all over it. But that was actually considered kind of architecturally innovative by some people, and there were some articles that it appeared as far away as Australia. There was a newspaper that talked about what you could do with a city space, kind of repurpose it for modern times. But it's great that they did dedicate it to pedestrians and not, as they originally talked about, for parking. And that part of it has remained. And of course, we still have a grassy patch today as well, but this was it didn't age very well. A lot of you remember that by the 70s, concrete doesn't look that good after 10 years or so, and it was gray and stained and cracking, and they finally took it all down. This is a couple of dancers. I think this is from one of the early Dogwood Arts festivals. That's my guess. I'm not sure about that, but it's Indian or Latino dancers on the square, and this was in when they first started having the Dogwood Arts Festival, as opposed to just Dogwood Trails. They had a lot of it on Market Square, and it was kind of a big deal. The New York Times came here and did a couple of stories about it, and it was kind of an exciting new thing to happen in Knoxville in the early to mid 60s. It was something pretty special. All right, this is Paul's idea to include these. These are pictures that I took as a kid, and people who know me now know that I hardly ever take pictures at all, and maybe shouldn't have then. But I was about 14 years old, and and I heard they were going to be tearing down these buildings, like the old Stratford Hotel building. That its tower had already been taken down, but it was still there on the right side. I heard they were going to be taking these buildings down for TVA, and I came downtown a lot in those days, and I had a little Brownie, like a 1905 Brownie box camera, and took a picture of this place. And that says cafe. That was the old Gold Sun Cafe. And that, of course, that's still, the facade is still there as the front of another restaurant. But all the stuff on the right is the one I'm talking about. The photograph on the left, the stuff on the right is where they built the TVA towers. And this other picture is taken from down on Walnut Street, looking kind of north or northeast at the original Mayo's. That was what Mayo's, which we all know now is a garden store now in Bearden and farther out west and other places, was mainly a seed store that catered mainly to the farmers who came to Market Square. That was their main clientele until they started the garden store business in the 1950s. But this was the original Mayo's location up there on Wall Avenue, down near Walnut Street. That's again part of TVA now. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, and I would be happy to hear if you have any memories or any comments or questions or anything else. Market Square is just such a rich story. It really is American history through a pinhole in a way. And would if y'all have any comments or questions, I would love to entertain them now. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And please, yeah, have a look. We have my Market Square book. We have copies of that. It's and like Paul said, it's in its second edition. It's sold pretty well over the last several years, but it's still, I'd like to think, still pretty relevant. And of course, we have the Bearden book is still new, and we're getting really good comments on that so far, and it's selling fairly well.